Okay, so the last official lesson of our chapter here, you have your test next Friday. You have a quiz coming up Tuesday. Hopefully it doesn't throw everything off, but I'll probably find a way to make it up for you that I'm giving you a quiz or an assessment after a 3-day weekend, but it'll all work out. Just make sure you do your job and do the best you can do, and you'll be fine. Part 1 is about 2 types of problems that we need to be ready for. The first one's going to be a problem that involves fractions, and again, I'm not really going to go too deeply involved because I think most of you are aware of what's going on. But here's what's nice about this, is that these 3 things all equal 0. And just like what we learned with elimination, that if you take 2x plus 3y equals 6 and you multiply everything by a certain number, it turns to 6x plus 9y equals 18, and that these 2 are still the same thing. Here's where it's nice. Because if I was to multiply everything in this equation by 3, notice that it ends up being 2x squared because your 3's eliminate, or your 3's eliminate there. Minus 12x plus 6 still equals 0. Again, the nice thing about this is 0 times 3 is still 0. All we did was just make this a little bit bigger, and we're going to do our job from there. So from there, we again will do, let's see, multiply as to be 12, as to be 12, I don't think happens. So a is equal to 2, b is equal to negative 12, c is equal to 6. Negative b plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Negative b turns into 12. Again, be careful. I saw a lot of people making that mistake yesterday as I was answering questions. All over negative 12 squared minus 4, 2, and 6. And that goes over 2 times 2. So just to check, negative b, negative or b squared 4ac is good, and then let's go ahead and get this done. Again, this is going to be 12. I was supposed to split negative, negative 12. I see that now. Here's the thing about whenever I do the square on this part. If I do negative 12 squared, it's going to be a positive answer. If I do 12 squared, it's going to be a positive answer. So you might see me on occasion whenever I'm kind of using my analysis side, I just use 12 squared. In other words, I ignore the sign and I just type the number squared, because that way it's not going to be confusing. But I won't do that for you now. I'll actually take that back. I never said it. Don't blame me for saying it. So negative 12 squared minus 4 times 2 times 6 equals 96 all over 4. 96 I need to check, so 96 divided by 4 is 24. And that is 4 times 6, which means 2 and 2 make 12, plus or minus 4 root 96. I'm sorry, 4 root 6. Wow. All over 4. And that ends up with these all being divisible by 4. So 3 plus or minus root 6 over 1. It's just 3 plus or minus root 6, because we do not put it over 1. So that would be how that works. Again, if you see that, the key idea here, because the solving part we're going to be mastering by next week, but the key thing for you to understand is if you see a solving problem that has an x squared, that has something like that, and there's a fraction, don't be afraid that you don't know how to factor with fractions. Chances are you're going to probably have to use the quadratic formula, but you can still check. But again, the first thing you want to do is just get rid of the fractions the way we learned, and that would take care of everything there. The second type of problem is set up in a way where solving using algebraic elimination is probably the best option. This occurs whenever there's an x squared but no x. Some keys to remember about that: don't forget you eliminate a power with a root, so if you want to get rid of a square, you square root both sides. And also don't forget, whenever you square root both sides, you must use the plus or minus. So whenever you go to do this on your test, which I think at some point you're going to have to on your test, make sure you remember your plus or minus. That is everything. So the example here is that we have 8x squared plus 216 equals 0. And again, there's an x squared but no x, which means I can honestly just use algebra the way that I learned and subtract 216, bringing down 8x squared equals negative 216. I can then get rid of the 8 because squared is power, or exponents are stronger than multiplication, so I'd move my 8 by dividing 8 to both sides. 216 divided by 8 is 27, so x squared equals negative 27. And then you get rid of a square, by square rooting both sides. The funny thing about this is that this is a negative number, and so x comes down with plus or minus, don't forget that. And 27 is 9 times 3, so plus or minus 3i root 3 would be what we have here. Alright. Second portion of notes is intended to help you decide when to use. Again, this is the last official lesson of what we're doing here. So what we're doing next week is trying to zero in on everything that we need to do. There's a whole bunch of different types of solving that we've seen. And even though they're not a whole bunch, but there's just different types. Solve by factoring. And it helps if you kind of remember these 4 different types of factoring. X squared x number is the one that has the shortcut, where the numbers that you find go directly into the parentheses. It'll help if you know that. Difference of squares, again, is your 2x plus 1 times 2x minus 1 shortcut that you need to learn. GCF typically is whenever you have an x squared and an x. Typically, because what we just learned is whenever there's an x squared with no x, or x squared and a number, I would use that one. But again, in terms of solve by factoring, if there's an x squared and an x, I'd pull off my x term, leave the rest, and then solve those 2 factors. And then you have ax squared x and number, which is the one where you have to use grouping. But again, all those lead to solving by factoring, because after you factor those, you set your factors equal to 0, and you go from there. Option 2 is solve using quadratic formula. What that means is you have a combination, for example, numbers that multiply to be 18 and add to be 4. Well, there's nothing in the combination tree of 18. 1 times 18, 2 times 9, 3 times 6. None of those add to be 4, which means you cannot do grouping, you cannot do any kind of factoring, and so you have to use a quadratic formula. But that's like your biggest sign that you have to use it, is that you searched your combination, but for some reason you cannot find the numbers. But just be careful to make sure you actually know how to find the numbers, because it would, I don't know, I wouldn't like to do all those steps just to find out I skipped over one that really was the answer. And then the last one that we just talked about is solve using algebraic elimination, which has x squared but no x. So again, we have x squared, x and a number, x squared, x and a number, x squared and just x. You have the difference of squares, which is x squared minus a number, and then you have the one where it's x squared but no x, again x squared and a number, but again that just kind of comes with it, practice and experience. So looking at these, determine which option will work best if given an option. I guess that's kind of redundant, but other than that, what I would do here is recognize there's fractions. I would multiply everything in here by 11, getting 4x squared minus 11x plus 6 equals 0. Looking for numbers that multiply to be 24 and add to be negative 11. Those numbers are 3 and 8. So in this case, factoring is probably your best call. Again, not going to go through it, but just so you know, that's pretty much what you'll do, is set it up, go through the combination check like you normally would. That is if you just want to use a quadratic formula, but it is good for you to know both, because you never know when one might be necessary. So for the test you can do it, but again, the quadratic formula is going to take a little bit more time, and remember that your test is a time limit type of thing. Here, B, this is already set up, so we're looking for numbers that multiply to be 11 and add to be 6. There's nothing outside of 1 and 11 that goes, so this here would be your quadratic formula. Because again, if you can't find the numbers that actually can be factored, obviously you have to use a quadratic formula. C, again, this is where you want to start practicing. For me, I see an x squared and an x, which means that they obviously have something in common, but this to me is GCF, where I can take 2 out of both of these numbers, take an x off of both of these numbers, and I'm left with 8x plus 13 equals 0. And then of course this is solving by factoring, because you would put 2x equals 0 and you would put 8x plus 13 equals 0, and that would give you the 2 answers that you're looking for. Again, we'll get to practice on that, but solve by factor would be that one. This here is also solved by factoring to some extent, because you have an x to the third. And again, this is one of the questions you're definitely going to see on your test. You have an x to the third x squared and an x, which means you can take off your x, which leaves us 6x squared minus 5x minus 10 equals 0. But how do we solve this? That's where we've got to look. numbers that multiply to be negative 60 and add to be negative 5. I don't think that exists. So 1 and 60, 2 and 30, 3 and 10, 4 and, 3 and 20, 4 and 15, 5 and 12, 6 and 10. None of these make 5. That's 4, that's 7, and so therefore this is probably quadratic formula. So again, one of your answers is going to be 0, obviously, because of that, and that is a factor, which means that you would have x equals 0, but you would actually use a quadratic formula to determine what this is to get your answer. And then the last type, E, has a couple of options. You could do the quadratic formula. You would just have to make sure you use b is equal to 0. But again, I would be leery of using b equals 0 because it really doesn't do anything but make your answer just a little bit more complex. But you can solve using algebra. You could solve using a quadratic formula. You cannot solve using factoring because it doesn't really factor like that, and you would need your x to be somewhere, and you end up having to do algebra anyway. But again, the two on that would be algebra or quadratic formula. Again, I would work on the algebra thing just to see if you can get used to it, and then use next week to try to really zero in. But for today, when you see that, try the algebra just to see if you can do it, and get the help if you need it. But other than that, Math XL is waiting on you. Don't forget your key for your vertex form is also waiting on you. I hope that's helping you out to do this once a day instead of a whole bunch in one day and then kind of forgetting about it. But you will have to do vertex form on the test, and I'm assuming you recognize that it's going to be a negative vertex form. So go ahead and get that down. And other than that, good luck.